Well, today we're going to return to our discussion of Harry Stack Sullivan. And Sullivan is actually the first theorist that we're discussing in this series of psychoanalytic thinkers who actually never met Freud. And as you will see, he was obviously very influenced by Freud, but not so influenced that he had a personal relationship with him and felt an allegiance to him. And as you will note, as we move along, he actually breaks from Freud significantly. Now, you may recall also that Harry Stack Sullivan wasn't your brilliant student. He was tossed out of school. The only degree that Harry Stack Sullivan had was an MD. He did not get a bachelor's degree, but back in the times that he went to medical school, which was between 1910 and 1920, people could get into professional schools without necessarily having an undergraduate degree. So he had one degree. And while he wasn't your classic good student, he really was an original thinker. And that's what makes him important for us. And after Sullivan completed his medical degree, he trained at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., which is really a famous treatment center for psychiatric patients. It's a state hospital. And St. Elizabeth's actually is the center of where a number of famous court cases have taken place. Often when we get to a point where we think there are patients' rights who are being violated, often the cases that go to court are cases that come out of St. Elizabeth's on issues like perhaps the right to treatment or the right to be released from a hospital if you're not dangerous. All kinds of issues like that have actually been tested in court with patients who were in St. Elizabeth's. Now, Sullivan's fame actually in the field came from his work with schizophrenic men, for whom he established a residential treatment program founded on his theory of interpersonal trust. And that's going to be the theme throughout with Sullivan. It's going to be on interpersonal involvement. One somewhat unusual thesis for the time that he proposed was that like cures like, which led him to select as staff for his hospital, that is for the schizophrenic ward in the hospital he was involved with. He chose people who were sensitive and shy because he saw those as characteristics of schizophrenic people. Now, it's interesting that he came up with that because later you find that, and in fact today quite commonly, people who treat individuals who are alcoholic or drug dependent often take that position. That is, there is a group, a significant group that believes like only someone who's been alcoholic can really know what that's like. Only someone who's really been a drug addict can know what that's like. So that treatment centers should really be run by people who are alcoholic or drug dependent, and the staff in there should have had those problems at some time in their life. Now, on one hand, this is a ridiculous thesis, and it's very overstated. On the other hand, this is not without merit, and in the sense that if you look at who has done the most for alcoholics, certainly one would have to say that AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, has been more a source of treatment and assistance for people who have problems with alcohol than any other form of intervention you can mention. The problem is when you take things, and by the way, in Alcoholics Anonymous, everybody really is alcoholic who's in Alcoholics Anonymous. And then there are other groups like there's Al-Anon, which is a group for the spouses of alcoholics, and membership in that self-help group is dependent on the fact that you are a spouse of or family member of an alcoholic. And then there's even Alateen for the children of people who are alcoholic. But the extreme in this is the idea that only someone who actually has suffered a disorder could know a disorder. Sullivan didn't go as far as Alcoholics Anonymous in saying that only someone who had been schizophrenic. But what he did say is that people who had some of the personality characteristics that he saw in schizophrenics, and schizophrenic people tended to be shy people, tended to be sensitive people in the sense they reacted to so much, that he thought those people would be more helpful to them. Now, Sullivan believed that psychological growth really took place in the interaction between two people. And of course, then that begins with the mother-child relationship. And he felt that the progress of learning how to relate starts with the mother-child relationship and then culminates with your involvement with a sexual partner. And he defined personality as the relatively enduring pattern of recurrent interpersonal situations which characterize a human life. So you'll notice it's an enduring pattern of recurrent interpersonal situations that characterize a human life. And important for him, he means that this is special for each single person. Now, Sullivan's theory can be described in 6 stages that he developed. And in many ways, like Freud, his stages are heavily focused on infancy and early childhood through late adolescence. Now, throughout these stages, Sullivan emphasized, first, interpersonal involvements. That will always be key for him. Secondly, yes?
Is there any way to go back to the other screen real quick?
Sure. Can you flash back to the first slide, please, for a moment? Oh, I need to flash back. That's the problem. Okay, let's see. Here we are. Sorry about that. Okay. And now what I was saying is that in these stages, Sullivan emphasized interpersonal involvements first. Then, secondly, the experience of anxiety. And thirdly, the experience of personal security. Now, those 3 elements are going to be key in the way in which Sullivan looks at various stages. Now, for him, as you would certainly guess, the infancy stage starts with birth, and it continues until there is the appearance of speech. So he doesn't give you a specific year so much, although speech for many obviously starts in the first year of life. But if it doesn't start till later, it doesn't matter. That's the period we're talking about. Now, this first period, infancy, is a period in which children do not differentiate themselves from others. And we've talked about that a number of times. This is the little infant that is trying to make some kind of adjustment to being outside the womb, has only known being inside the womb for most of his or her existence. And so this is a youngster who is simply trying to learn how to cope with this new environment. And so these, young infants simply directly experience life as being either good or bad. It's very simple to them. And Sullivan especially emphasized the good mother. And the good mother was the person who provided warmth and nurturance. So the good mother might have been dad, might have been a nanny, might have been a grandparent, it might have been anybody. But most often, mom, the real mom, is the person we're talking about. And he felt that this ability to provide warmth and nurturance was very important. And he actually very specifically focused on the mother's nipple as capable of providing both warmth and thus security. And he also noted that since mom's nipple could provide warmth and security, if that nipple were unavailable and or irregularly available, then the child could experience a lot of anxiety. That is, the child wouldn't know that he or she is going to have the security whenever they want it, or they're going to have nurturance whenever they want it. So he coined this term, nipple of anxiety. And the term nipple of anxiety really is a term referring to whether someone basically feels nurtured and taken care of. Now, the very first stage of experience that Sullivan referred to is called the prototaxic mode. And this simply refers to the earliest feelings of a child in which there is a state of kind of generalized sensations or feelings, but it's before thought starts. In other words, there's an absence of thought. In the prototaxic mode, that's the first experiences the child has right after birth, and they're simply generalized sensations. Then the next mode is called the parataxic mode. And this is experienced as the infant becomes a child who begins to use speech. But during this period, the child actually makes few logical connections and certainly doesn't have connections within a sequence of experiences. In other words, the child can use words to identify needs and use words to receive gratification, but that's as far as the communication takes the child. The child simply has some words that will identify needs or wants. Then there is a third mode, and it's called the syntaxic mode. And this develops when the child realizes that words actually have meanings that can be shared with other people. Up until now, words are just something that are used in order to call attention to a need. Now the child begins to have some insight. Words are actually ways to share. And it is at this time that the individual actually understands there can be communication between two people, and that the experiences of the child may be different than the experiences of other people to whom the child relates. And the child begins to discover you could actually talk about these differences. So once we get then to our syntaxic mode, the child really is now beginning to operate in an interpersonal world. And that takes us then into the second stage, which Sullivan called childhood. And Sullivan saw this stage emerge when the child is really much more actively learning to speak as a form of communication. And it lasts until the child shows a need for peers. So in the childhood stage, children learn lessons of basic functions, such as feeding, toilet use, cleanliness, obedience, learns about oughts, learns about musts. In other words, learns about what's expected in the world that the child is now living. And at this time, language actually becomes a tool for manipulating the social world into alleviating the child's tensions. Also, during this time for Sullivan, the self system of the child continues to function as a system to relieve or reduce anxiety. So in the early stages, The self system is very focused on the control of anxiety. Sure. This particular ends when the child begins to experience a need for peers. And so that's when we move into the juvenile area. And this is the point then in which a child begins to seek companions and to begin to seek peer companions. And for Sullivan, this really is a true period of growth in that the child begins to recognize things like there are rules at school and rules for being with other children, and that they may be different than the rules and the expectations that are experienced at home. So social accommodations are made, sometimes by pressure to be part of a class or part of a team. But this is a very rich learning time for the child. Lots of new things are happening. And the child finally is aware that not only is there me and is there mom and maybe dad and whoever is at home, but there are all these other people. Now this then, for Sullivan, led into the stage of pre-adolescence. And this stage is characterized by the need for interpersonal intimacy in the form of a close friendship. And this is similar, or the close friendship almost always happens with someone who is somewhat similar to the child. It typically occurs between ages 8 and 10. And this is when the child is beginning to realize what is important to other children and how he or she can have a good relationship with another child. Now, normally this is a period where the child would have a best friend, and the best friend would be someone of the same sex. And Sullivan especially emphasized the closeness of a best friend and how larger groups can be formed by having two best friends involved with two other best friends. And perhaps even in a group, you might have a significant number of people. But his observation was within that group, there is always a person who is closer to another person. In other words, within the group, there are always dyads, where two people are much closer to each other than they are to the other people in the group. Sullivan also made observations that if one doesn't develop a best friend, one can become very lonely, because the absence of a best friend, especially when you observe everyone else has a best friend, can be very painful. And it's at this time that youngsters may begin to behave very inappropriately. And they may even take big risks of being rejected in order to be liked by someone else. And as you might imagine, of course, the big problem in this stage is if you see as desirable someone who would be your best friend, but that person sees somebody else as desirable and perhaps is already, the best friend of somebody else. So the tricky issue here is that you must find someone who is also at the stage you're at. That is, the other person is ready to seek a best friend, you're ready to seek a best friend, and so that relationship occurs. If your timing is off and that person has already developed a relationship with someone else, or if the person you choose doesn't have those feelings that you're the person who should be the best friend, then this can become a very anxious time. And for children, this can be very painful, and not being able to find the best friend that you really desire. And for many, if you reflect back in your life, this is a period where you may have had one of two possible, there are more than two possible, but one of two situations. One is you may simply have developed a relationship with someone. It may have been very good. You may have that relationship to this day. And you may not have a lot of thoughts about how it ever happened. And that happens a lot. That is, somehow two youngsters start playing with each other, they get to like each other, they go to school together, they share a lot of things, and it just happens and it seems very natural. And when that happens, you don't necessarily even have a lot of memories of how did it happen. You just realize this was my best friend. The other possibility is you didn't have a best friend, or you struggled for a long time to have a best friend. Now, there's more likelihood that you will remember that, because you may remember the loneliness, you may remember the anxiety that you had growing up when you didn't feel very special about yourself because no one else made you special. And so this is a very important time in development. Now, after this stage, we go into early adolescence. And this stage is characterized by the beginning of puberty and by the need for intimacy that comes with strong sexual feelings. And Sullivan felt that the way he characterized this was he talked about these strong sexual feelings as actually lust for another person. And what he was trying to convey is that in this early experience, this is fairly irrational, and that lust was used, I think, as a term meaning more the young person wants to gratify their feelings. They don't have a whole lot of insight into the fact that being loving means caring about another person, that sexual acts can be very loving communications. This is when the child is just beginning to discover, I have all these feelings, and somehow the person wants to express them. And so what Sullivan did is he classified these lust and intimacy needs into three categories. One was an orientation to others on the basis of intimacy needs. What he meant by that simply is that someone else is creating stimulation in you, but the focus is very much on yourself. Then, secondly, he saw kind of an orientation to others on the basis of the other person's status. So that he said in some cases, these very strong sexual feelings early will be directed towards someone of your own gender, someone of the opposite sex. They may be directed towards animals. If you can't deal with people, you may have sexual feelings towards animals. And we'll talk about that in a moment as a form of psychopathology. But he felt they're going to be directed somewhere. And the third orientation he talked about was to others on the basis of how the genitals are used during sexual intercourse. Sexual intercourse is really not correct. I should have said really sexual interaction, because it's going to be much broader than intercourse. And in a moment, I'm going to make some distinctions about what he meant about all this. Now, Sullivan then created categories for the expression of intimacy needs. And in his first category, he postulated choices of intimacy expression that correspond to three kinds of people. First, he said, there is the autophilic person. And this is a person who manifests no pre-adolescent development, because either it didn't occur, or else a person attempted it and it was very unsuccessful. And so what happens with this person, having either no real experience with feeling close to anyone, or having been rejected and having experienced a lot of anxiety, the person directs all of their sexual feeling to themselves. These are the people we've named earlier as being narcissistic. It means that the person is too frightened to reach out, so the object of their love, at a time when most are trying to reach out to care for other people, this is a person who's still focused totally on themselves. Then he said, there is the isophilic person. And this individual has been unable to progress past pre-adolescence. And so this person continues to regard as suitable for intimacy only people who are very much like himself or herself. So with this person, it means that their sexual feelings are directed towards people of their own sex. So he would say there is a stage where if people are not safe enough, they are more likely to be homosexual than they are to be heterosexual. Then he had a third type, the heterophilic person. And this is the person who has made the early adolescent change, in which he or she becomes intensely interested in achieving intimacy with people of the opposite sex. Now, Sullivan, as I've been mentioning, was very sexually oriented in this description, in that he meant that in the category of orienting towards others on the basis of a partner's status, he is referring to lust. That is, he's just referring that you want to express some kind of sexual feeling towards someone who has the status that makes you feel safe. So as I mentioned, that might be to someone of your own sex because you're safer with them, or according to him, if you had matured more, you would be thinking of somebody of the opposite sex. He also felt, though, that not only was there kind of a heterosexual orientation to the opposite sex, but he allowed for what I had mentioned earlier about the fact that somebody can get to the point that they're able to relate to anybody else, whether it be from their own sex or the opposite sex. And so he thought of that as the autosexual person. So as you'll see in this, we have those who relate homosexually, those who relate heterosexually, those who relate autosexually, who are really fixated earlier. And then he came up with this category, Ketta Sexual. And this meant that one preferred sexual activity with non-humans. And by that he meant a person would want to be sexual, and might be sexual, with animals or even with dead people. Now, you might say, this is a little weird. Well, remember, this is a man who is developing a theory of personality with most of his experience being with schizophrenic patients in psychiatric hospitals. And schizophrenic patients have been known to do some fairly weird things. And so he had to account for this kind of behavior, and so he built it into his theory of personality. Now, Sullivan also talked of lust regarding the use of genitals, and he thought there were 4 ways that such lust, feeling, intense sexual desire got expressed. First of all, there was orthogenital, which involved the integration of one's own genitals with what might be called, or what he called, the natural receptor genitals of the opposite sex. That is, a person really has involvement heterosexually with another person. Then he said, there is the paragenital person, who uses the sex organs in order to seek contact with the genitals of the opposite sex of oneself, but in such a way that will not cause impregnation. So our first person was going to be heterosexual, really be involved in intercourse. Now we have the paragenital, wants to make sure that that doesn't happen. So what Sullivan posited is these might be people who kind of, rub their genitals against each other, but you don't have penetration, and you avoid any possibility that impregnation would occur.
Can you put the slide back up, please?
Sure. Can you put the slide back up, please? Okay. Now then, there's a term MetaGenital. And MetaGenital use does not involve one's own genitals, but actually another person's genitals are involved. Masturbating somebody else, for example, or performing sex on another person would be examples of what he was talking about when he used the term MetaGenital. Then he had a term amphigenital, and that refers to the case in which both members of a pair, and both people may be of the same sex or they may be of different sex, but they take on a role that is different than that person's usual sexual role. For example, a woman might strap on a penis-like device and then use it to have sex with her partner. Mutual masturbation might be close to this. But the point that he was making here is that people engage in a form of sexuality. That is, they engage in a form of genital activity. But it is different than one would stereotypically think. Now, all that then happens during this stage. That is, all those possibilities are available during the stage. He wasn't saying that someone actually engages in all of these activities. He was allowing for the possibility that one might express the urges of this stage in one of these multiple ways. Now then, he goes on to late adolescence. And for him, late adolescence is the time when the person really does establish love relationships. And so in this stage, not only is biological gratification important, but genuinely getting to know and appreciate the other person becomes important. And a significant element in this stage is that a person actually learns to tolerate some anxiety while attempting to truly get to know another person and to accept the complications involved in an intimate relationship. So once there's kind of been that activity of the last stage where, people learn to be sexual. That is, they learn they have sexual organs, that they have lots of stimulation, there's lots of feeling there. Some attempts are made to express this. Then you begin in the next stage to actually understand that you can share this with another person, and it becomes important in the sharing that you understand the other person is different than you are, and that you be able to tolerate some anxiety. That is, that intimate relationships, especially when you're young, have anxieties. And the ability to tolerate anxiety is going to be key as to whether you can keep an intimate relationship alive or whether you're going to get frightened and you're going to withdraw from it. Now then, we come to what did Sullivan do with this theory? Now you can see from some of the examples I've given you that Sullivan, like all the psychoanalysts actually we're going to talk about, or that we've talked about till now, really developed their theory on the basis of listening to patients. So you always have kind of a skewed approach, because what is actually deviant almost to an extreme, or absolutely to an extreme, when you think of the whole general population, isn't so extreme when you limit yourself to working only with very troubled people. Now, what did Sullivan do in psychotherapy? Well, the one really famous contribution that Harry Stack Sullivan made was his focus on the psychiatric interview. And in fact, he wrote a book called The Psychiatric Interview, which is clearly the best known book that he published. And interestingly, it wasn't published till after he died. But he is given much credit for focusing on the interpersonal psychodynamics that go on in the interview. And he really wanted to call attention to the fact there are two people in the room, and the interviewer is very, very important to the interview as well as the interviewee. Now, what he believed was that interviews should be structured, and that very specific data needed to be collected, and that once you collected a lot of data, all of it involved very significant interpretation by the therapist. So he felt you had to have a lot of information, but once you had the information, and this is much like Freud, the information wasn't what it appeared to be. That is, the reason you were gathering so much data is you were really trying to learn about the unconscious. So you would have to make a lot of inferences from the data. He further believed, by the way, and it's very consistent with what I just said, there is no such thing as objective data. And that the real understanding in therapy comes through the interaction between the patient and the therapist, helping to clarify the unique meanings of each person. So, he would posit, and certainly I think therapists have for a long time, that the fact that two people describe what seem to be similar lives doesn't in any way tell you these two people are really alike. Because you have to get into talking with someone about what certain events really meant to them. And not only what events meant to them, but how much anxiety or pain or uncertainty were associated with certain losses. So it's quite possible that two people had similar losses, very significant loss. Let's say one's father died and one was aged 4. Well, you don't want to jump to conclusions that two people who had such a painful experience resolved it the same way. It may be that someone had dad die at age 4 and mom got very depressed. In many ways, not only did you lose dad, you lost mom at the same time. And there may have been that this is an only child, so there was no one there to help the child. Now, it could be very different if dad died at age 4, but mom quickly realized that this will be traumatic for my child if I don't do something, so mom becomes even more involved with the child. Or other people, there's an older brother who takes over and begins to respond in many ways like the father did. So what Sullivan wanted to point out is you don't want to just generalize from an event. What you want to do is to explore what did the event really mean to the person who is telling you about it. Now, this interaction then that went on between the therapist and the patient, or perhaps in language that's often used with Sullivan, between the interviewer and the interviewee, had 4 stages, and there was a process of 4 stages. The first stage is called inception. And this is kind of the formal meeting of the patient and inquiring about why has he or she come for the interview. It's the period where the therapist begins to gather some information from the patient, and the patient gets to know what is this therapist like. That's followed by what is called the reconnaissance stage. And this consists of obtaining a rough outline of the social or personal history of the patient. So you kind of get the broad dimensions of the patient's life. What really happened with this person? What can they remember? What did they tell you about things that were particularly anxiety-provoking or distressing? What were things that seemed to go smoothly? Now, once you get this general picture, and this is why Sullivan is so known for talking about the therapist being very active, was he felt you now must explore this kind of broad outline of someone's life in great detail. And so you go to the third phase, which is the detailed inquiry. And this really is the critically important phase in treatment for him, where there's really an in-depth exploration of the patient's life. And it's during this time, of course, that you try to understand many of the distortions that people may have given you. That is, often when you ask someone about their early life, how were things prior to age 3 or 4? People sometimes say, fine. It was really a good time. I mean, I really enjoyed that time. Now, during this time, you might take someone back and you might begin to really seek details about that period. And you might find that while the person, has basically repressed all the conflict of the area, they may start telling you when you really push for details that, well, You know, when I was, 2.5, my mom became ill, and she was hospitalized for 2 months. And I remember that because my father took care of me because he was out of a job at that time. And I remember that there was a lot of worry in the family because, we didn't seem to have a lot of food then. And you begin to go back and you begin to find out there were all kinds of meaningful things going on which this person has never really attended to. And what becomes important about those things are whether or not the person has developed a lifestyle whereby when something painful or scary occurs, they just repress it. And that often is typical of what you find with someone in therapy, and it's why they're in therapy, is often because they can't maintain relationships, because every time something really serious happens in the relationship, they tend to not want to discuss it, they tend to not want to deal with it, they tend to talk about it as if it's unimportant. Meanwhile, the other person knows it really is important. It really is important whether or not in our relationship one of us is going to go on to graduate school or not. And it's really important in our relationship whether, if one of us is going to graduate school, is the other person going to support us? Or if we're at a point in our relationship where we want to have children, it really is important that we talk about it, that we realize our life will change if we have children. So if you got someone who takes these kinds of events and always treats them like, well, it won't make much difference, the other partner gets very scared. And often that's when the other partner begins to talk about leaving, and thus that generates real anxiety, and thus you get someone coming into therapy. Now, the final phase of therapy, Sullivan called interruption. And this can mean that, and this is a very broad term he used, and it's not especially helpful, because what it really means is either he's talking about the ending of a session, and he just referred to that as interruption, or it can occur because therapy has really been successful, and therefore it's time to stop therapy, or it can occur because the person quit. So this term is it certainly is vague, and it can refer to several events which are really quite different from each other. Now, in some respects, one could see Sullivan as adding to Jung and Adler's theories that the therapist really must be active in order to truly explore the patient's personality, and that the quality of interaction between the therapist and the patient has much to do with whether someone will improve or not. Now, this is a very important concept, and there are times in the history of psychotherapy where this has been overlooked. For example, the idea that any therapist could treat any patient. If you follow the logic of what Sullivan is telling us, that interaction between the patient and the therapist is very important, then one should ordinarily come to the conclusion the therapist should like the patient. The therapist should have respect for the patient. This is going to come out much stronger later on, too, when we talk about people like Carl Rogers. But the idea that was promulgated early in psychoanalytic theory, which was that you just listen to the patient, you listen to the primitive free associations of the patient. Only when people began saying, well, depending on who you are, you will hear those primitive associations differently, did we get to the point of recognizing that it does matter that the patient and the therapist are in tune with each other. Therefore, it does matter that the therapist is respectful of the patient. That doesn't mean that you have to like all the behavior of the patient in order to treat someone. It is very difficult to like somebody who has committed rape, has committed murder, has killed a child. You can't start off with the premise that you're really going to like this person. What you can start off with, though, is a respect that something must have gone terribly wrong in this person's life for the person to have engaged in such outrageous and totally unacceptable behavior. If, on the other hand, you as a therapist were to loathe that person for what they had done, then you should not be seeing them. It's very unlikely, certainly in Sullivan's terms, that a therapist with that kind of predisposition is ever going to be able to explore with someone the kinds of traumas they've had and show them the kind of regard that will make them feel safe enough that they could actually try new behaviors. Now that's going to take us then through Harry Stack Sullivan. Those are the major contributions that he made. And as a psychoanalyst, he was the person who really helped in many ways for people to understand there is much more going on between the therapist and the patient than sometimes had been noted before, although it would be fair to say that both Jung and Adler and Horney all said that the interaction between the patient and the therapist is important. It's just that Sullivan developed that thesis further. Now, the next person that we're going to be looking at is a man named Erich Fromm. And Erich Fromm developed what we will call, and what he called, humanistic psychoanalysis. And it flows very much from what we have just talked about. And just, to prepare you for him, you're going to find that Erich Fromm, like so many of the psychoanalysts, were born in Europe, were products of the culture of Europe, and then came to the United States, where they had to confront yet a different culture. And it's interesting when you follow the flow of how they developed their theory, that you'll see that their theory changes, and Fromm's probably most dramatically, as he moved from this position of being a European person with a very conflicted history to coming to America, which he saw as having a very conflicted history. Well, we'll take a break now, and when we return, we're going to really talk about Erich Fromm. He is a most interesting person. By the way, let me mention to you that in terms Okay, we are going to return to a discussion of Erich Fromm. And Erich Fromm was a psychoanalyst who actually is the second person that we're studying who never met Freud. And most of the psychoanalysts up until now, as you notice with the exception of Harry Stack Sullivan, actually had a period of time where they studied under Freud. And it was after studying under Freud that they decided that what he was saying really wasn't accurate, and so they developed their own theories. now we're getting into people who became part of psychoanalytic schools, maybe did not have a direct experience with Freud, and therefore their breaks were more intellectual and didn't involve like having to tell a friend, or in the case of Freud, for many of them, a mentor, that he was wrong. Now, Fromm is really quite an interesting man. He was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1900, and he was the only child of Jewish parents. And he was very Jewish. He was a dedicated student of the Torah, and he really developed a love for his ethnic background. And a sad result of this was that he responded very strongly to anti-Semitism. And he experienced a lot of isolation when he was a youngster, because Jewish youngsters were undergoing very difficult times when he was growing up. Now, on top of being a very committed Jew and seeing all the anti-Jewish sentiment that was around him, he also came from a family that had a lot of conflict. His father was described as over-anxious, and his mother was described as depression-prone. And then there is an event described in Fromm's life, when you read his history, that was especially painful. There was a woman friend of the family who was beautiful and successful and talented. And when Fromm was 12, this woman committed suicide. And this was, one of those kind of dramatic moments for him to learn that it would be possible that somebody would take their life. And remember now, this is a young man who was really loving his life, even in the midst of the conflict that he saw. And what this suicide did to Fromm is it motivated him to really begin to examine what is the meaning that people have in life. That is, as he reflected back later in his life, he realized that what happened when he saw that somebody would take their life, which would seem to suggest that they had no meaning, that he began to search for why is it that he has meaning, why do other people have meaning, and you'll see this takes us into a very strong existential influence that existed in his theory. Now, Fromm became a student at the University of Heidelberg, and this was at a time when the social sciences were actually delivering a number of new ideas. This was the period, for example, where Karl Marx's theories were very popular. And also in biology at that time, Darwin was getting a lot of play, and people were talking about evolution, and this was drawing a lot of academic attention. And this was a time when Freud was first starting to get known in the universities, and people were actually talking about this new theory of personality development. And Fromm was exposed as a college student to all of these theories. And they were particularly important to him because they provided him with a meaning of the complex emotional life that he himself was experiencing at the time, but he really couldn't understand it or appreciate it. But he liked, certainly, what Freud was saying, because Freud was saying there's a lot that's unknown to you in your emotional life. And here is Fromm, who is having all of these feelings and figuring, I really don't know all that's going on inside myself. And now what happened with Fromm is that he pursued a PhD in sociology. But his real interest from his undergraduate days really was in psychoanalysis. And certainly psychoanalysis pervaded his academic life from the point at which he first got exposed to it. Now, Fromm actually was analyzed by a psychoanalyst, Hans Sachs. And Hans Sachs was a famous analyst of that time. And then Fromm went on for psychoanalytic training at the Psychoanalytic Institute in Berlin. And at this latter institution, he encountered such figures as Carl Abraham, whom you may remember was a very significant figure in the life of Karen Horney. And there was Theodor Reich and Franz Alexander. These are all the leading psychoanalysts of the day. And they're all at this Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute. Now, eventually, Fromm immigrated to the United States, and he became an American citizen. Then, in 1941, he published his first book, and it was on a theory that he was developing, and the book is called Escape from Freedom. And essentially, what Fromm did is he integrated Marx and Freud, as well as other social thinkers, but he developed his own kind of unique socio-psychological theory. And it is socio-psychological theory that Fromm really becomes known for. He next published a book called The Sane Society, in which he took a philosophical position that Western society is sick because its citizens are alienated both from themselves and from others. And once he began thinking along these lines, this was really the beginning of an existentialist approach to life that appealed to Fromm, and kind of existentialism becomes a real part of all of the rest of his writings. I would mention to you, by the way, Fromm is actually a very interesting person to read. If you were to get any of his books, you would probably find this rather intriguing because he was a commentator on the social scene, and he was very much into looking at the complexities both of the person and the society in which the person operates, and how those two really end up forming personality. Now, in the second book, he especially focused on the lack of reflectiveness in the society in which he found himself. And as he looked at Americans, he actually saw people as being managed. He didn't think people were really being creative. He thought their life was being determined. And he observed, in factories and other places that workers were primarily passive. And they were accepting jobs that really were very dull and possibly inappropriate. And he saw people as having fantasies about how things could be better, but he didn't see the action at that time of people trying to make life better. So he felt there was a great deal of failure in society. And his observation was that people were simply too frightened to change things. So what happened was people led these dull lives, experienced these unexciting jobs, but he recognized that he had fantasies. And of course, this was an era, by the way, like when movies many movies, were real displays, hundreds of actors and actresses and lots of dancing and gowns and things like that. And he saw people escaping to kind of a grand world that they might like to be in, but actually their lives were humdrum. Now, Fromm's solution for how people could lead an integrated, self-directed life was in his philosophy of humanistic, communitarian socialism. And these are terms that you'll see come up several times. His theory involved a social...
Can you say it again?
Sure. Humanistic, communitarian socialism. Okay. Now, his theory involved social, legal, political, economic, and a moral system in which individuals took a much more active role in life, in which people really tried to structure their own life in terms of all these interacting systems. Now, Fromm posited that if individuals did not take this type of control, they could never really experience themselves as productive and as involved in mature love. So, he was an observer saying people have to get more active in society and make society the kind of society they want, or they really won't be able to realize their own potential. Now, as with other existentialist thinkers of the day, and also, I might add, many psychoanalysts at this period were also very existential in their thinking. Fromm believed that the central motivating behavior for a person is an attempt to find a reason for your existence. That's what people were seeking in life. By the way, as you can tell then, if that's the major thing, then for Fromm, your focus is very future-oriented. That is, your focus is in the here and now, looking out to the future, because you're seeking meaning. Again, very different from the early analysts who would have you spending most of your time looking backwards for meaning. Now, in spite of some of the things I've laid out, actually Fromm was an optimistic theorist. And he believed that people really can choose to lead healthy and productive lives by developing their potentialities. But he also noted that people can choose to escape from responsibility and allow others to control their lives. And in fact, he even went so far as to say he thought you could allow people to destroy your life. And that's where, you've let somebody else have so much control, there really is no you anymore. And again, consistent with existentialist thinkers, Fromm grappled with what happens to a person who truly accepts responsibility for his or her life. He noted that being mature and attempting to have personal freedom can create self-doubt, it can create anxiety, it can create insulation, it can create insecurity, it can create a sense of aloneness, since he believed that when you grapple to develop meaning in your life, in many ways you do it alone. It is your life. You are trying to find meaning for your life, which is different than the meaning of all other people's lives. And so he felt this was risky business. He felt you had to be pretty mature to really be looking for a meaning in your life, to be examining yourself and asking yourself, amongst all these people in which I live, how do I make a difference? Why am I important? Why is my life meaningful? And if you were willing to ask those questions and to grapple with them, life could get scary at times. Oh, just a second here. I've not brought up our... Sorry about that. Now, Fromm developed a theory, and in order to break it down, I'm going to be somewhat simplistic. But you can reduce his position on human needs and how these are expressed by looking at 6 character types. And we'll discuss these human needs first because they lead into other parts of his theory. One of the profound life experiences upon which Fromm focused was the need for relatedness. And again, focusing on the existential condition, Fromm believed that people really wish to seek mature love. And he defined mature love as a union under the condition of preserving one's integrity or preserving one's individuality. So mature love is a union in which you are involved with someone else, but you are able to preserve your own integrity while being involved with this other person. And such mature love involves a concern for the welfare of others, but it truly focuses on attempting to make another person happy. Now, you notice how much of our early psychoanalytic thinking, the focus was on how the individual tries to make himself or herself happy. Fromm is saying that there really is a need in people to make other people happy, certainly if you're going to be mature. So here we have a very major step away from Freud. And Fromm had the healthy notion that you could truly desire to care for and love another person because you really wished to see them happy, excited, self-fulfilled, that these kinds of feelings were quite possible, they were quite mature, they were the way life should be. And his focus on social needs allowed him to move away from Freud's theories that anything you did was really driven by some sense of trying to do something for yourself. Now, strangely enough, having emphasized that, Fromm was criticized at times for abandoning the biological theory of Freud, and some gave the explanation that this only occurred because Fromm studied sociology. And had Fromm been wise enough to study medicine, he would really have found the truth, which was in Freud's theory. So here you get a real split between the people who are focused on kind of the biological determinism of Freud and by this much more socially and existentially driven theory of Fromm. And this simplification, you know, that you really have to choose between one or the other, was really over-determined by people who really resented that when Fromm began to become popular, he took a lot of attention away from a traditional psychoanalytic theory. That is, when thinkers began to read Fromm, people got very excited about his ideas because, of course, they were liberating. They made people feel good about themselves. They took in, you know, concepts like really loving another person. And so this caught on, and he was very popular. And also, Fromm deviated from psychoanalytic theory in another way, and that is he didn't put much emphasis on what they called romantic love. And instead, he posited there's really a deeper experience in mankind where mature love was the goal in expressing one's need for relatedness. Romantic love, you know, simply meant kind of like being sexually involved with someone because they attract you. And Fromm went past that, didn't pay a lot of attention to that, and said, no, what the focus should be for an adult is on mature love, which is much more complicated than just being attracted to someone. Fromm also allowed for the achievement or satisfaction of a need by destructive tendencies. After all, he's going to see patients, he is going to see people being destructive. And in the need for relatedness, he noted that people can be submissive, or they even can permit other people to simply dominate them. Thus, an individual might develop what we would call masochistic tendencies by making the other person all important and making oneself and one's own needs unimportant. One also can pathologically seek, according to Fromm, to gratify, you know, these kinds of destructive needs through sadism. That is the way in which you try to overcome your aloneness is by trying to dominate, in the extreme, even humiliate another person so that the other person will not leave and they will remain with you. Now again, when you think back to our character types we've talked about before, the only person who's going to remain in such a relationship is someone who is incredibly dependent and who thinks nothing of himself or herself, and so they allow somebody else to truly dominate them. And Fromm even indicated that if you have pathological relationships, like I've just described, it is possible to achieve what might be a fictional union, but it certainly will be a union without love. It will serve a purpose or an end, but he felt this is not at all what he wanted to talk about or what he was interested in. Instead, Fromm posited that being human actually causes us to need to transcend the human condition. And because we have both reason and imagination, we can attempt to be creative and go beyond whatever limits we feel we have. That is, the limits of who we are at this point. And he saw this as a healthy experience, and in which we invest in new life and ideas by loving other people. So he wanted people to think about the fact that you can be more than you are, and if, by extension, therefore, you can make the world a better place than you see it now. Again, because he saw a lot of troubled people, he also allowed for the negative side of transcendence. And the negative side of transcendence, of course, led to destruction. For example, he felt that people who were incapable of love and of earning love might actually try to destroy a loved object. A very crazy way to go about getting control, but certainly one he observed. An example that he used was if you take a male lover who kidnaps a woman because he desires to have this woman and she has no interest. And then in the extreme, he ends up killing her because he cannot cope with not having her. So it turns out, in this very psychotic kind of thinking, by destroying this woman, he finally gets control over her. So Fromm was pointing out that, you have these wonderful urges if you're mature, and you really can change life, and you can transcend who you are now. But if you don't go in a positive direction, these very powerful urges can take you into a very pathological lifestyle, and one in which terrible things can occur. Now then he talked about the need for rootedness. And this need is closely developed along lines that Freud used, actually, to explain the Oedipus complex. Essentially, Fromm felt that mothers are extremely desirable to most children, and that there is an interaction between mother and child that creates a great deal of specialness. And this specialness allows the child to feel rooted in his or her environment. And Fromm believed that Freud actually recognized this sense of rootedness in the way he described the intensity that takes place in the Oedipus complex. But Fromm felt that Freud put too much emphasis on sexual characteristics during this experience, and not enough focus on the irrational affective origins of this attachment. That is, what Fromm was focusing on is not the stimulation in the body, and especially in the penis or the clitoris that goes on during this phase, but rather he was focusing on the more powerful psychological feelings one has of greatly desiring mom and of wanting to be close to mom. Essentially, Fromm indicated that it is extremely important for us to have roots so that we have a sense of security that will enable us to move towards this experience of being transcendent. Without these roots, his feeling is we become too frightened to seek gratification, and we become too frightened to take the risks that are necessary in order to enter into a transcendent sense. Now then, Fromm said, people have a need for identity. And this, again, is a healthy concept in which Fromm posits we have a need to express and to be our own unique selves. He emphasized that we need to discover ourselves and to be the kind of unique or special individual we desire, rather than to become someone that others wished us to be. And that certainly was what he saw as the conflict for people. Either you become that unique person you can be, or if you don't have the ego to do that, then perhaps you will become the person that others want you to be. And others can be mom or dad. Others can be some important person in your life. Can be your spouse. Others can be what you think society in general wants of you. Now, obviously, if you really give in to letting others determine your life, it's a pathological condition. And whereas if you give in and focus on this deep desire within yourself to be a special person, to be a unique person, to kind of discover what is very particular about you, you become healthy. And again, when he talked about this concept, he also said, there's a lot of personal risk if you decide to do this. The more you decide to be yourself, the more you're probably taking risks, and the more anxiety there may be. Now next, he talked about the need for a frame of orientation and devotion. Now, Fromm used this term to describe the perspective we need on reality as a means to make sense of our multiple experiences. And the concept here, by the way, really is quite complex. On the one hand, Fromm believed we need an orientation that allows us to account for how we behave in life. At the same time, he posited we also need what he called an object of devotion. He sensed that most people worked this out in terms of having a God, but he allowed for a similar working out for individuals who had ideals that they might pursue. So that if God was not this kind of transcendent person or transcendent belief that you move towards, you might substitute something like justice, where your life is dedicated to trying to make the world a just place. Or it might even be mature love, where your life is very dedicated to trying to do something for another person or other people. Actually, Fromm more identified with this latter, that is, with people seeking a sense of justice or a sense of love, and he was not focused on religion later in his writings, although as a young man, he was a very religious man. Now then he talked about the need for excitement and stimulation. And he speculated that we all have this need. And he based some of this research, or he based some of this really on research, that indicated that without stimulation, we're unable to socially function. And for example, if you observe what happens to people who are in stimulus-free environments, you find that people become disoriented. Put people in a room that's all white. There's no stimulation. There's no sound, no music. They're just there by themselves. Actually, this can become quite disorienting after a time. For some people, they even become psychotic. That is, given that there is no stimulation around them, they manufacture a world in their mind, excuse me, to substitute for the fact that there's no stimulation. And this observation, by the way, caused some psychologists to do research on observations people were making about patients who undergo bypass surgery. And, excuse me. What actually happens, or what did happen at one time, was there was a belief that when people come from some very traumatic experience, and of course in the early stages when bypass surgery was being done, this was traumatic. It's traumatic today, but it was even more traumatic then. And so what people wanted to happen is they wanted people who woke up from surgery to feel calm. So they actually put them in rooms in which there were no pictures, there was no clock, there was no stimulation at all when you woke up. And the idea being that people would then feel very calm. Well, that's not at all what happened. When you think about it, when people were undergoing bypass surgery, their biggest worry was, will I live? So when people were waking up, some of you have an active fantasy about this, when people were waking up and there was just white walls and there was no stimulation around, there was no clock, there was no windows, people began to have fears that perhaps they did not survive the surgery. And we found that with some people, actually, they started to get very anxious, even though they may have known that they had survived the surgery. But the lack of anything familiar really made them very anxious. We found in actually a striking number of cases, people actually became psychotic for a brief period of time after bypass surgery when they woke up because they were so frightened. So what happened was they went to actually creating stimulation for people, so that they now put people in rooms where there's a clock, where there are pictures, where there are things that will be familiar to the person, and often, have a loved one there. So when the person wakes up, right away you're in an environment that you're familiar with. And this is very important to people. And we have found that having stimulation seems to be absolutely necessary for people. And it is most necessary when very important events are occurring. So what happened with Fromm's theory, then, it allowed us to posit that stimulation is actually necessary, that it's helpful, and that it overcomes threats that occur in many circumstances. And the ultimate way, what the insight that Fromm had was that stimulation actually can serve as an integrating force, so that when the person, say, awakes from a traumatic experience like having undergone serious surgery, the very fact that there's stimulation begins to integrate the whole trauma with the fact that I have survived and that my life is whole and that good things can happen. Now, Fromm then also developed character types. And he did not accept, as I've said several times, libido theory. Instead, he replaced it with two observations of his own. First, he observed that individual differences in temperament generally existed in people. And from this, he argued that character, which is what he thought was the part of your personality built on experience, and temperament, which is what he thought was constitutional in your personality, combined to influence behavior. Then secondly, and this is actually more important, Fromm believed that people had innate needs and potentialities that unfold in the course of development, providing the social conditions are good. So he focused, he allowed for temperament. He allowed for some biological part of you that does play a role in shaping your personality. But he really thought that personality development is much more social. But it really blossoms if the conditions are right. And so, having observed that, he then looked at, well, what could go wrong? And so he believed that early life led to the formation of 5 basically neurotic character types. And he allowed and talked about 1 healthy character type. Now, the 5 neurotic character types start with the receptive character. And as we go through this, and I'll point this out to you, but you'll see many of these character types, of course, you will recognize from some of our early theorists. Receptive types are people who believe that the source of all good lies outside themselves. These individuals, in many ways, then are much like Freud's oral types, in that they're highly dependent, and they see the resolution of life as being contained in what can other people do for me. And like Freud, he described receptive characters as being cheerful, friendly, optimistic. In other words, they have learned how to appear to society so that society will do things for them. And the important issue here is that individuals take on this style of relating to others not out of any concern for other people, but because the person feels that he or she can be cared for through contact with someone else. And it is only through that kind of contact with someone else that one has one's needs fulfilled. If you think back, even Horney's compliant type would also be very similar to Fromm's receptive type. Now then, he said, like the receptive type, you can have an exploitive character who believes that the sources of gratification are, again, outside the person. However, rather than relating gently and passively and with good humor and being nice, this character type aggressively seeks to gain attention and to seek nurturance by using force or cunning on other people. And this subgroup exploits other people for their own ends. You could describe them as being people who attempt to seduce another person's spouse, or as persons who might plagiarize the works of other people. What is important here is that aggression is used to seek satisfaction, and it's solely for oneself. It is motivated by a profound belief that no one would really respond to the person, so the person must aggressively go out and get people or get things for themselves. You might recall that this is similar to Horney's aggressive type. And just if you just listen to how this person behaves, you realize this is a very desperate character. I mean, and as you can imagine, if you knew someone like this, you would quickly want to not know them. So this is not somebody who most of us would be attracted to. Now then, Fromm talked about the hoarding character. And the hoarding character has many characteristics similar to obsessive-compulsive personalities. This person saves things, behaves in ritualistic ways, and frequently is obsessed with orderliness and cleanliness. If anyone tends to interfere in this world, the individual often strikes out, being protective, very self-protective, wanting to be alone. And the hoarding type character, according to Fromm, rarely has interpersonal relationships, and certainly no in-depth relationships or intimate relationships. This is somewhat like Horney's detached type. And what happens is, I mean, this person really limits not only relationships they have, but they even limit within their own home, for example, or their own apartment, what could possibly happen, because everything is so orderly. In other words, there are no surprises. I never have to wonder where something is. I know where everything is. And I make sure that, I won't have any difficulties with this by not letting anybody else in my apartment or in my home. So this is a very rigid, unhappy kind of life. Sure. Did I not? Let's see. Well, let's go back here. Okay, what did I miss? I wasn't. Okay, we did exploitive. Here it is, right here. Oh, you can't see it. Oh, can you put up? I'm sorry. Okay. I apologize. I didn't realize you had never seen it. Okay, here's the exploitive character. Okay, and then after the exploitive character, we have the hoarding character. And after, the hoarding character, we're going to have, and you'll love this term, we're going to have the necrophilus character. Now,
we didn't get any of those.
I'm sorry, can you leave these up for a moment? Okay, have you seen?
Okay, that one we have,
You've got that one.
but we need hoarding. That was long.
Okay. It's, in the slides, of course, they're going to be the same as I'm telling you. So if you've been taking notes, you're not going to have really missed anything. But I do want you to see this. So has everybody had a chance now to? Okay. Sorry about that. Now, what is interesting about personality theorists, they often go along and they have these terms that most of us can identify with. I mean, most of us understand what hoarding is, and most of us will understand a lot of the words that are used. And then someone comes up with a term like this, like the necrophilus character, which one has to really pay attention to because this is not a term you tend to throw around in everyday language. It's not a term that, in fact, most of you will ever have used. This character type, by the way, is actually quite disturbed and is similar to the kind of early anal age fixated people. The individual tends to be destructive through actively exploiting and destroying other people and things. Essentially, all meaning in life comes from being hostile towards others. This is a person who has absolutely given up on intimacy. And Fromm noted was that people who developed this type of personality were frequently racial bigots. These people might be terrorists. They might even engage in enjoying torturing other people. And this latter idea, actually, that Fromm developed came from his observations during the Second World War, or at least that's what people speculate. And it's interesting, anyone who lived during the Second World War, obviously, in Europe, and he left Europe, but the war had already started. And he would have been a young man in his early 20s, and he was Jewish. And by then, the anti-Semitism, of course, was terrible. And there was all kinds of pain. And one of the fascinating things is that, people who saw that were so stunned by the terror that occurred during the war that they needed to come up with some way of explaining this. Fromm's way of explaining this was with the necrophilus character. That is a person who actually could enjoy doing great harm to other people. And also, in terms of Fromm himself, it took him a long time to come to grips with this. He did not write about this till more than 20 years after he came to the United States. And one of the things that we observed, by the way, amongst other people who saw atrocities during the Second World War, we often found in VA hospitals on psychiatric units into the 60s and 70s, especially in the 60s, often we had patients who had some kind of psychiatric problem during the Second World War, so they were still getting treated many years later. But most often, these people could not talk about what went on in the war. I mean, it was fascinating. We had a whole generation of people who went to war, they came back from war, they could not talk about it. They could not talk about it because they had never been prepared for such atrocities, some of which they had to engage in the sense that obviously if you are in the military, you may have killed other people. With Fromm here, what happened is it wasn't that he engaged in any atrocities, but he felt absolutely helpless, as so many did, in observing atrocities or knowing that atrocities were going on. Now, the next character type he talks about is the marketing character. And here, Fromm developed his own unique approach to a type of personality that he presents here. That is, this is not like any of the other types that you have heard about. We don't find a comparable description in Freud or Horney in this. What Fromm said is that in industrialized societies, people learn to treat themselves and others as if they're commodities. And thus, they bargain themselves for other things. And he would say that marketing types simply love another person for the value that that person brings to the relationship. And so when there is no more value for the relationship, then the person abandons this individual to seek another loved object which might have a greater value. So in this character type, all relationships are seen in terms of barter. And there is no altruistic or genuine feeling that's existing between the marketing character and any other person. By the way, you know, this is certainly if any of you watch soap operas. I mean, soap operas often are built on these themes that somebody is valuable till somebody else comes along. And people are always breaking up because there is someone else who has so-called more to offer. Now, as I mentioned, Fromm had these character types, and so he had a number of pathological character types. He had only one healthy character type. And he comes up with this wonderful term, the biophilous character. Another word that you use every day, common parlance. But personality theorists, when they wanted to say something important, often came up with a word like this that we would pay attention to because it's certainly not a term that it gets used a lot. The truly healthy person was called the biophilous character. This is a person who loves life and seeks to be involved with others in a caring, thoughtful, and exemplary way, never utilizing force or manipulation to draw attention to themselves, but trying to make themselves important by being so caring. In this character type, people are free to be reflective and imaginative and to discover their own unique capacities and capabilities. And they also have the capacity to understand the uniqueness of other people and to become emotionally involved with unique other people. And Fromm noted that people who represented this character type had to work very hard at being loved, since this entailed a great deal of self-reflection to understand themselves and a great deal of reflection to understand the other person and to invest significantly in them. Now, from these character types, then, we find that Fromm was much more social than other theorists. And he brought in not only social but economic forces as being determinants in personality development. And what's important for you to remember about him is he did place much more emphasis on appreciating the culture, appreciating the rewards in culture, and appreciating the scariness that can take place if the culture is not helpful to you. Now that will conclude our discussion of Fromm, and we'll move on to Erik Erikson in our next class. Thank you.